Hey, Mark, how's it going?
Fine, yourself?
Great, man. Great, great, great. Great to have you back.
Good to be back, although the word round two makes it sound like a boxing match.
Yeah, no, it's just a way to keep track of the conversations. Nothing serious. How are you doing? Are you still in Boston, Mark?
No, I got back 2 days ago.
Okay. How was the trip?
It was actually a slightly nightmarish flight to Boston. I got diverted eventually to New York,
Okay.
and then it was a bit of a shambles. But apart from that part of it, I mean, I ended up losing almost a whole day.
Uh-huh.
But once I did get there, scientifically, it was just fantastic. I really enjoyed it.
I know I saw some of you did a presentation at Tufts. Um, yeah, it seemed like a really great time.
I did a presentation which I was happy with. I was very happy with how it was received by some people who I respect. So it's
Mm.
it's good to get good feedback from minds that you admire.
Yeah.
And then there was also the added dimension of Mike's lab. I mean, I know about his work, but to actually visit his lab is just quite extraordinary.
I'm actually going to touch on that at some point because I wrote a note here about the collaborations you guys are doing. Friston, Fields, Levin. I mean, there's so much happening here, and it's so exciting from the outside. I asked Mike about this about a week ago, and it just seems incredible. He left me with a nice question for you right at the very end. What is the meaning of life? I tweeted this to you. Mike also, he just wants to know, he thinks you actually might provide a very valuable answer to this because he thinks that your background in neuropsychology will help enhance this answer. So give us that.
Well, actually, I'd forgotten that you tweeted that. I wish I'd prepared an answer, because that's not the kind of question one likes to receive. What is the meaning of life, especially when you're expecting a serious and satisfying answer?
Mm.
So, um, what I would say first of all is we must distinguish between the sort of purpose of life and the meaning of life. The purpose of life is very easy to discern. It's to keep on going, being alive. It's to survive and to reproduce, I'm afraid, is the purpose of life described biologically.
Mm.
I mean, because of course life is a biological thing, and so when you speak of, well, what is it for? It's just for keeping itself going. That's all it's for. But that doesn't mean that's the meaning of life.
Mm.
So I would draw a distinction between us as biological organisms, which are just struggling to resist the second law of thermodynamics and keep going, or is resisted for as long as we can, and then we lose. I would like to distinguish between that and the being of an organism, our subjective existence. That's where I think the word meaning is appropriate. It's like, okay, so I'm here. What am I going to, what should I do with this, other than just carry on from a biological point of view, existing as a living thing? What is the meaning of all of this? And my emphasis, of course, is on feelings. As you know, I think subjectivity is fundamentally constituted by feeling. We are feeling beings. That's what being is. To be, for the, that phrase, there's an organism that there's something it is like to be, that organism. It is a feeling organism. Now, our feelings, again, as you know, because I've spoken to you about this before, they are just the way in which we become aware of our needs. So you could look at that biologically. You could say, well, the reason why, for example, the reason why pleasure is attached to sexuality is because that's how our species reproduces.
Mm.
And so from a purely biological point of view, sex is pleasurable because that's got to do with that purpose side of things. The meaning side of it, I mean, why do we actually have sex as subjects, as feeling beings? It's not because we're trying to do our biological duty, not at all.
Yeah.
we're in fact, most of the time that we have sex, we are hoping not to reproduce. So it's not a small distinction. It's a very different thing. What we're doing in terms of what motivates us as sentient beings, as subjects, has to do with. So it's for that reason, for me, it has been a very important part of the meaning of my life, is to try and understand, what is this? What is feeling? What is it? What is it all about? And to try and understand it, I think that's been a very worthwhile quest, to try to understand what is it to be and what is feeling. And I personally can't find a more worthwhile way of spending my brief period of biological existence trying to understand what it is all about. I'm perfectly happy with the meaning of my life from that point of view. Now, I used sex as an example because it's so easy to see the biological versus the subjective, but it applies to all of our needs. What we are living it's like, let me take something even more prosaic. We don't we eat chocolate and sweets and stuff, because they taste nice. The reason they taste nice is because they've got high energy content. That's what makes them taste nice. But we're not thinking, what I really need to do is get high energy supplies. What we're doing is saying, I really like this, So the other main thing I've done in my life is train in and practice psychoanalysis. And that's really, you could easily say that it's not the only way of going about it, but it is one of the. Like there are many Eastern traditions where, like meditative traditions and so on. In fact, I met a very senior Buddhist when I was in Boston now, and so I spoke quite a bit, interacted quite a bit with that way of approaching the same task, which is really trying to properly confront what is it to be mortal, what are these feelings really for, what do I feel about them, what are my values, what do I want to do in relation to my felt needs, which include needs to not only survive and reproduce and eat, but to have fun. Play, it's terribly important. To recognize that has been a real discovery in my life, and to recognize it as an experiencer of the need to play, the need to have fun. So the more I've understood about how minds work and how my mind works, the better I'm able to enjoy my mind, and recognize that it's inevitable that there's no such thing as a conflict-free existence. All of our different needs they need to be balanced with each other, and you become more sanguine about it all, and allow yourself to appreciate, what it is to and foregrounding feelings has been a very important. Not only because of my own work in relation to the neuroscience of feeling, but also in relation to psychoanalysis, getting to know your own feelings, face up to them, face up to your conflicts, ponder how are you going to deal with them, recognize you're never going to be exempted from conflicts, and so on. So I suppose what is that? There's a phrase, the examined life.
Yes, something like that. Life is not worth living.
Yeah, and also the old, know thyself. I think that's the meaning. That is the meaning that you end up, that I end up realizing. That's the best you can do with life, is to wonder at it, to ponder it, to try to understand it, to reflect upon it, to be fully alive in the sense of being alive, not biological life, but experiential life. To ponder it, to reflect on it, to study it, to wonder at it, to appreciate it,
I think we're similar in that case, and this podcast obviously embodies that curiosity, that sort of this quest for us to try and conquer this mind. When I spoke to Mike, that question came at the very end, and I remember it's because apparently Mike gets a lot of emails lately regarding the meaning of life, and he's not a psychologist, so he doesn't have this background. He's not a philosopher, so for him, he gets caught in between a rock and a hard place because he's obviously not an expert in those fields. So he said he'd rather just shift that onto you.
I'm not surprised he gets emails like that, because his work, I mean, it really is pretty fundamental in terms of, what is an organism, and what is life right at the most basic level of single cells and so on. It's fantastically interesting what he's doing.
It's pretty cool, and I know that you were in Boston. You visited Mike's lab. First, I don't know if for all of those curious, do you want to tell us about that experience?
It was an extraordinary experience. I know about his work, but knowing about something and experiencing it is, are two different things.
And that's like the purpose of your work, pretty much. You actually got to feel it.
Yeah. So the main species that he's studying, he studies various different organisms, but these little worms that are the first thing that's astonishing about them, and to actually encounter one such worm, is that they're immortal. I mean, literally immortal. They've been around for millions and millions of years. They don't die. They just subdivide. And so there's no mixing of genomes. It's the same genome carrying on and on and on and on. And so in some very real sense, you're looking at a many millions of years old creature. And what's more, it's looking back at you. It's got these big eyes. So there's this encounter with an immortal being. Right. Then the fact that they subdivide, is what led Mike to study the mechanisms of morphogenesis. How does an organism know what it's meant to become? And how at the most fundamental mechanistic level does that happen? Then you can chop these creatures in half, and the head grows a tail and the tail grows a head. And so, having studied what those mechanisms are, he started to fiddle about with them, because if you really do understand a mechanism, in fact, the one way in which you can convince yourself and your colleagues that you do understand a mechanism is to make an intervention in it and predict what the consequences will be. And if you can predictably control that mechanism, then you really do understand it. And so, as you no doubt know, he made a two-headed worm. By manipulating these bioelectrical fields that are what guide the morphogenesis. So I also met a two-headed worm, which was something to behold. I mean, it's just really extraordinary. And then when those worms subdivide, they subdivide into two-headed worms. So he sort of created a new species.
Yeah, I think those are the ones he calls xenobots, eh? I'm not sure if that is.
The xenobots are, so they're various, like he takes a tadpole and shifts where its eye is going to be, and they end up with this frog that sees out of its arse. But I mean, all these things could be, they could be perceived as ghoulish or even as in all sorts of ways inappropriate. So it's important to remember that ultimately what it's all about is, to what extent can we translate this basic knowledge from the lab to the clinic? And it has profound potential implications for how we treat amputees, how we deal with situations where currently one has to do organ transplants, the possibility of being able to regenerate a diseased organ rather than to transplant it, and so on. I mean, the possibilities are amazing. But then in terms of, you said, what are we doing in terms of collaborations? The main overlap it's the main overlap, because actually there are many ways in which our interests and research intersect. But the main overlap is, I believe, and there's a long story that attaches to that. So I'll just come to the conclusion. I believe for lots of very good scientific reasons that the fundamental form of consciousness is feeling. And feelings enable us to know how well or badly we're doing in terms of remaining within our viable bounds. So moving out of homeostasis feels bad, moving back towards homeostasis feels good. And what this does, that's an adaptation beyond mere homeostasis, because many homeostatic mechanisms are purely autonomic. There's no feeling involved, like blood pressure regulation and so on. By being able to feel homeostasis, feel how well or badly you're doing in terms of your attempts to maintain your biological bounds, enables you to change your mind. This is not working. So before it's too late, you alter your behavior, you change your policy. And so why that's so important is it enables a creature to survive in an uncertain, unpredicted environment. So you can come up with novel solutions to life's problems. By feeling your way through the problem, you're not limited to a single stereotyped response. When you find yourself in a situation for which you do not have an innate phylogenetically given response, you can feel your way through the situation and come up with a novel response. That is what I've just described is the very basis of voluntary behavior, which is no small thing. And then we learn from the experience, and so we can adapt to unpredicted situations. And God knows there are many of those in life. We can do them during our own ontogenetic development. Now, the crucial thing is that with Mike fiddling about with these creatures, the problem of what do you do when you've got two heads is a novel problem. Yes. It's not something that species was prepared for by evolution. What happens if you move the eye to an unexpected location? This is not something for which there is any possibility of there being an automatic inborn solution. And so I'm very interested in what way is the sorts of things that these very much simpler creatures than ourselves, the way that they're solving these novel problems raises questions of, how far down does feeling go? Is a creature like this worm feeling its way through a problem? Because if it is, then wow. I thought that I had set a cat among the pigeons when I told my colleagues I don't believe that cortex is the organ of consciousness. I think that the reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray, these structures that we share with all vertebrates. So, for example, with fishes, I thought this was radical, but if it goes down even more than that, then the implications are just gigantic. So that's where my work overlaps with Mike's, and that's what the collaborations. And there's also Chris Fields. I don't know if you know him.
Fields, yeah.
And Richard Watson. So we've all been. In fact, Mike is a great. He gets the right people together.
Yes. It seems like a collaboration.
Yeah.
I asked him for a name. If you could just give me like a nice name of this group. He said he called it the Field of Diverse Intelligence. Are you happy with that?
Yeah. I can't remember what he gave them. His lab was called something like the Center for Possible Selves or something like that.
You know, it's very creative in that regard. But I was just, it's so fascinating to see all these great minds come together, because then I told him it's almost like the Avengers of mind getting together and trying to solve the hard problem. It's pretty cool. So from our perspective, we just want to say thanks. Tell me, so
Look,
sorry, continue.
I think that we are living through a sort of a golden age, if not of neuroscience as a whole, certainly consciousness studies. I think we really are at a very interesting and important time in the history of that field.
Yeah, it seems to be just escalating so much more and so much faster that hopefully we're around to see what happens next. I mean, it's kind of disappointing knowing that we're at this forefront, and you never know if you're just going to be alive long enough to see it. Do you ever get that sort of anticipation anxiety?
Well, it's not the way I experience that very issue that you're discussing. It's more from the other end, the way I experience it. It is that when you go against the grain, when you say something like I just said now, I believe that a child who's got no cortex, that this is a conscious being, that there is something it's like to be such a child. It really doesn't win you a universal approval. People start saying, if you go against the compact majority view in a science, your science defends itself.
Yes.
And so what I'm leading up to saying is that I have found more courage than I might otherwise have had. I'm willing to take risks and to say, well, I know that this is going to put many noses out of joint. I know many people are going to think I'm a nutter, that I've lost my way or whatever. And I'm less anxious about that than I otherwise would have been, because I know, you only live once.
Yes.
And as you can see, I'm not a kid, so I'm just going to throw everything I have at it and try and make as much progress as I can, regardless of not regardless of all consequences, because I am very concerned about the ethical consequences of some of the issues we're dealing with. So it's not I don't care about any of the consequences. It's that I don't care about the consequences for my reputation. That's what I mean.
Yeah. So you've lost that worry about the trivial stuff. You're more focused on the bigger picture.
Yeah, well, it's because I realize it is the bigger picture. There's times in my life, earlier in my life, when I have been very thrown by the fact that, just to take a very earlier in my career, when I made some discoveries that made me realize that what my entire field believed about the brain mechanism of dreaming was wrong. That dreams are not generated by the part of the brain that generates REM sleep, that REM sleep and dreams are not the same thing. It was really a hell of a thing to have all of your seniors, all of the great authorities in the field, all just being very hostile because you're spoiling the party.
You're going against the status quo. Nobody likes that. Nobody likes that. That complete. But I have a note on that. So the exact point you're talking about, I've written down some notes. So I think we'll touch on that soon. Let's start at the beginning, Mark. So the whole focus of this conversation for everyone watching or listening is on dreams and the hard problem of consciousness. It's a paper. I'll put a link in the description, and a very great paper as always. Read many of your papers in the past. You even know that I used one of your papers in Friston for my own dissertation back when I was writing it. So always a pleasure to read your work, Mark. And I'm looking forward to this. First, do you want to start with how dreams can assist us with this approach to the hard problem of consciousness?
Well, look, I have a great many things to say about dreams in general. But I'm taking your question in the narrow way that I think I heard it. You're saying,
before you do that, because I see my next question is probably will address what you want to tell me. We spend 20% of our sleep dreaming. Tell me why.
Well, that's the interesting thing. It's an embarrassment to science. Nobody knows why. The REM sleep was discovered in the early 1950s, and its high correlation with dreams, which is a sort of 90% correlation, was discovered in the mid-1950s too. And from then onwards, they were taken to be one and the same thing. Dreaming was construed as the subjective experience of REM sleep. REM sleep was construed as the objective physiological manifestation of the dream. So everything that we learned in the subsequent decades about what REM sleep is for, because of course it's a hell of a lot easier to study the mechanisms of something objective than of something subjective. So once that correlation had been established, the dreams were thrown out as like slippery fish. They were discarded, and we clung to this much more tractable problem of what is REM sleep, what does it do, and those are easy problems, because you can manipulate it causally. It's very easy, and we were therefore for decades. We were studying the biological function of REM sleep on the assumption that in so doing, we were studying the biological function of dreams, but they are doubly dissociable phenomena. You can have dreams without REM sleep, not only outside of REM sleep, but you can have dreams if you are incapable of generating REM sleep due to brain lesion. And conversely, you can have REM sleep without any dreams. If you have a lesion to the part of the brain that generates dreams, REM is preserved. Damage to the part of the brain that generates REM, dreams are preserved. So they are just simply not the same thing. Therefore, everything that we learned about the biological function of REM sleep, thinking that we were learning about the biological function of dreams, is not wasted work, because we learned a lot about the biological function of REM sleep, but it's wasted from the point of view of what did it teach us about dreams? It taught us next to nothing about the function of dreams. So I'll tell you what, now only in recent years have I turned my attention to that question and used appropriate methods, because I'm not conflating those two things with each other. I did a pilot study just before COVID, and then I was, of course, unable to conclude the study because of COVID. So I've only now, a couple of years later, started the bigger study. So I can only tell you what we found so far in our pilot study. In order for me to tell you that, I need to just take a step backwards and tell you that there are two parts of the brain which are essential for dreaming. I mean, of course, the whole brain in a way is essential, but there are two parts that are really the crucial mechanisms. The one which is not surprising is our perceptual cortex, the posterior cortex, especially visual cortex. It's not surprising because what are dreams, if not perceptual phenomena, and especially visual perceptual phenomena? If that cortical region is damaged, you can't dream because you can't generate the imagery. That's the actual hallucination can't be generated. But the other part is much more interesting. It's called the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine circuit, and this is a powerful positive motivational circuit of the mammal brain. If you stimulate that circuit electrically or chemically, it produces the most animated, exploratory, reward-seeking behaviors in the animal. Now, that circuit is essential for dreams. If that's damaged, you also can't dream. And so, that raises all sorts of interesting questions. But the one that I was interested in was how on earth, in the middle of sleep, with this, as I said, it generates the most powerful exploratory behaviors. When you look at the dreaming brain and you see that switched on, like a Christmas tree, you think, how on earth does this thing just lie there sleeping? It seems like an absolute paradox. So the hypothesis was that the hallucinated dream, it's a kind of virtual exploratory and other kinds of emotional motivated behavior, that happens instead of real behavior. Mm-hmm. So the way that the animal executes its motive, and when I say animal, of course, I'm including ourselves, where this motivational urge or surge goes to is into this imagined activity, this hallucinated virtual behavior of the dream, which means that if you can't dream due to damage to the posterior cortex, if you can't generate the imagery, then you should wake up, because the dream is there to enable you to continue sleeping. That was the hypothesis. And it's a lovely hypothesis because it's entirely counterintuitive. Mm-hmm. Most people would think if you can't dream, you'll sleep better. But on this hypothesis, if you can't dream, your sleep will be disturbed. And so in our pilot study, what we found was that on steroids. You have never seen such terrible sleep as you get in these patients who can't dream due to posterior cortical damage. They have sleep onset insomnia, sleep maintenance insomnia. They have massively more awakenings and sort of micro awakenings, what we call arousals and micro arousals. The sleep efficiency index is off the charts different, total sleep time off the charts different. So the one thing that although it's only a pilot study so far, but the results were so clear-cut, I'm prepared to say it publicly. The one thing that I believe we can say empirically, we have demonstrated is that whatever else dreams do, they enable us to stay asleep in the face of arousals, of things that would otherwise arouse us. Let's not forget, REM sleep is itself an arousal state. It's when it was first discovered, it was called paradoxical sleep. That was how come you're able to stay asleep when your brain is so aroused. So I'm saying that whatever else dreams do, they are guardians of sleep. They enable us to not have to wake up when we are motivated to act, to do something on the basis of arousals. Just are homeostatic deviations. So on the basis of homeostatic deviations.
And Mark, in terms of energy consumption, is this worth it? Is this constant need to experience worth the trade-off?
Well, remember, it's in a sense, it's the opposite of the question is, can we afford not to sleep?
That's true.
So, for the whole restitutive function of sleep, you can't do without that. It does. There's a hell of a lot of repair work and housekeeping that is done by the body and the brain. And including when I say housekeeping, including memory consolidation processes, how you process what you've learned during the day. There's a lot of very important work that is done by the body and the brain while you're asleep. And if you don't give yourself enough of that, you're a doctor, how bad it is to not sleep. It's a very serious thing to be deprived of sleep for your health. So it's can we afford not to sleep? And the work that needs to be done in order to maintain sleep is well worth the expenditure.
So it's almost intuitive when you think about it. I mean, the idea of this, because when you think about it, the average human, we don't really want to not experience. It's almost like there's this constant need to continue to have a continuous spectrum of experience. That's why a lot of people fear going under anesthesia. I mean, it's they know there's almost a switching off of this shutdown of the whole human experience. Do you feel like that makes sense? With
I think that.
Or is it different somehow?
No. I think that what you're saying is true, but there are also things which contradict it, and I will give you. I think there are three things I need to say about that. The one is the opposite of what you said, which is that we want to retain homeostasis. Mm-hmm. So moving out of homeostasis generates negative feelings. It's like air hunger or sleepiness or pain or whatever. These are all deviations from homeostasis. And pleasurable feelings are returns towards homeostasis. But when you're in homeostasis, you feel nothing. It's satiation. So, I'm hungry. That's bad. I eat. That's good until I've had enough. And then, it's over. Same with sleep, same with thirst, same with everything. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, is that in terms of homeostasis, for the most part, actually what we're trying to do is get out of the zone of feeling and into the zone of automaticity, into the zone of satiation.
But Mark, now, you actually feel satiated?
Well, you feel satiation as you come to the end of the return to homeostasis, but then that particular homeostat is off the radar. It's you're not busy thinking, I'm not hungry, I'm not thirsty, I'm not sexually aroused, I'm not sleepy. It's just not there. It's not on the agenda. You're feeling those things which are going well or badly, but once you are at the destination of those regulatory mechanisms, then they no longer are registered in consciousness. So that, as I said, that first thing I've said of three things I'm going to say, that's the opposite of what you were saying. However, here's the second thing. One of those homeostats is the very one I was talking about when I said this mesocortical, mesolimbic dopamine system. That has to do with the seeking drive, the exploratory, foraging drive, what some people call the epistemophilic drive. And how that homeostat works is quite different from the others. Its set point is I am engaging with novelty. I'm engaging with what I don't know. I'm engaging with what is uncertain. And if that sounds paradoxical, it's not. It's because uncertainty is dangerous. So if you have the opportunity to engage proactively with uncertainty now, then you'll have less uncertainty later. So what you're doing is actually building a better predictive model of the world. You're engaging with the world and better understanding how it works, which in the long run it enables you to better survive in that world. So the thing that you just spoke of when you said, don't we always want to keep on, that's fundamentally driven by this. It's not only seeking, but it's fundamentally driven by the seeking, the seeking homeostat. And then the third thing I wanted to say is that from all of this voluntary behavior of us engaging with the world, trying to find how do I get back to where I need to be, we learn from that experience. The conscious experience is the feeling your way through the problem. Then you lay down new predictions based on what you learned from that experience. And there, the biological ideal is to have predictions which are so reliable that you don't have to feel your way through the problem again. So that's again a trend towards zombiedom, that in fact what we want is to have predictions that are so reliable that we don't that they don't need reconsolidation. And so this is what we call non-declarative memory. These things that we just know how to do, like how to drive a car. You don't think, well, how does this work? You just know how to do it, how to ride a bike, how to walk, how to play the piano, or whatever. These skills that we acquire, they become automatized, and that is actually a good thing. So again, in those situations, I mean, like, I don't know if you play any musical instrument, or like if you play tennis, thinking about your stroke is a very bad thing to do.
Yeah.
It must just flow. And so in that sense too, although we don't feel it that way, actually unconscious automatic processes are better than conscious deliberative ones when it comes to learning from experience about how to meet your needs.
Okay. Now it's so let's say, so you had this hypothesis, you've done the studies, you've already uncovered quite a lot. There's obviously a lot more to come, but you've already touched briefly on this, but I think let's go into a bit more, because there's the gold standard I wrote in neuropsychology, where you guys discover, okay, REM sleep versus dream within the brainstem. When there's brainstem lesions and cortical lesions, there's clear differences in REM sleep and dream sleep. Do you want to run through those and exactly what those lesions are?
Yeah, I actually already have said this. So let me just be a little bit more precise. The mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system starts in the ventral tegmental area, which is sort of at the transition between midbrain and diencephalon. It projects upwards to the nucleus accumbens, which is in the ventral striatum, the underneath part of the basal ganglia. That's the sort of main destination. But it also projects beyond that up to frontal cortex and also down to amygdala. So it's a very big part of the medial forebrain bundle. Damage anywhere in that circuit, from the ventral tegmental area upwards, certainly up to and including the nucleus accumbens. But we've also had patients where it's anterior to the nucleus accumbens, they stop dreaming. The other area, as I said earlier, it's posterior cortex. It is in particular that there are two sites where we see cessation of dreaming. And I say two sites, it's really a continuous site, but it goes from the inferior parietal lobule down to the convexity of the temporal lobe, but then also around into the medial surface along the occipitotemporal, the medial surface. So it's basically a posterior association cortex, predominantly visual, but not exclusive, but by no means exclusively visual. So lesions there, those patients stop dreaming, but they tend to recover. They tend to recover. In one study that I did, I followed up 44 patients for a year, and only 2 of them were still not dreaming. But the vast majority recover within 6 months, in fact. And one of the reasons it's difficult to do research of the kind I was describing to you earlier, when I said we were taking patients with the posterior lesions who could not dream for that reason, and but the dopamine system was working fine. We wanted to see whether their sleep will be disturbed, which, as I say, it was. But many of our research participants recovered in the middle of while we were studying them, because dreaming does it's a very robust phenomenon, dreaming. I think for the very reason that I said to you earlier, that if it has a sleep protective function, then it's a very important thing.
When you first started out in the field, you've done a lot. You've already done so much pioneering work in dreaming. What's brought you back to this? Is it the link to consciousness, which we're obviously going to touch on soon? But was it that link?
Yes. In fact, when I studied dreams, I started my research in that area in the 1980s, and I must tell you, people don't realize those days consciousness was not a respectable topic. I mean, can you believe it? Even in neuropsychology, which you would think, psychology, hello, doesn't that have something to do with consciousness? It was, no, the only respectable topic as far as consciousness was concerned was not the subjective experience of anything. It was the brain mechanisms of sleep and wakefulness. So how the sleep-waking cycle is regulated, and the discovery of REM sleep was within that tradition. These arousal states that occur during the sleeping part of the sleep-waking cycle, and so I studied dreams. I was studying brain mechanisms of sleep and dreaming, and sleep was the intrusion of dreams or the intrusion of wakefulness into sleep. So wakefulness was a respectable topic, and so I dressed up what I was doing as studying sleep and wakefulness, dreams being wakefulness So the discovery of the brain mechanisms of dreaming at that time took me necessarily down into the basic arousal mechanisms of the brain stem, but bearing in mind that it particularly took me to this one arousal mechanism, which is the dopaminergic one. This is not just switching on and off the lights. It's an emotional, motivational mechanism. And so that made me aware it made me interested in the fact that these brainstem arousal mechanisms are the brain mechanisms of emotion. And that led me to working with York Panksepp, because York Panksepp was the only person who said, these brainstem arousal mechanisms generate affect, they generate emotion, they generate feeling. And then that was the second stage of my work, from sleep and dreaming to emotion, and then the realization, which is the phase of my work that I'm in now, that these mechanisms that generate feeling and affect and emotion are the very same mechanisms that generate consciousness itself. So that the foundational elemental form of consciousness is affective feeling. And so it sounds as if I've been all over the park, but actually it's really quite a straight line.
It is. I mean, and obviously in your paper, you lay this out perfectly. You talk about, okay, this, of course, if this is affective feeling and if we're experiencing constantly within this dream state, it must be something that's necessary during consciousness, in conscious experience. So this is a perfect place to actually look, because you don't have to, consciousness can occur outside. Dreams have to include some sort of a conscious experience in a sense, because it
exactly. Yeah. Now that's a very interesting point, what you just said there. So, one of the reasons that I focused rather on the brain stem than the cortex, which also didn't win me any friends. It's really to say in neuropsychology that the cortex is not the organ of consciousness is really to say something that goes very, very, very much against the grain. But a strong reason why I did that, I mean, there are many reasons why I did that. When I say reasons, I mean, there's much scientific evidence that led me to conclude that. But within that body of evidence is the fact that the cortex can do just about all of its cortical things without being conscious.
Yes.
So things that only the cortex can do, like recognize faces, read with comprehension, and so on. You can read with comprehension, and your behavior will be altered by what you've read, without any conscious awareness of having seen anything at all. So most of when I say most, I mean really just about all of the research on trying to identify what they call the neural correlate of consciousness was using vision as the cortical vision, because that's the conscious type of vision, as our model example. But as I've just said to you, the cortex can do all of that visual gymnastics unconsciously. So, so vision, even cortical vision, is not an intrinsically conscious function. So why do you think you're going to solve the hard problem of consciousness by studying something that is not actually necessarily conscious? The reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray, these brainstem structures that generate feeling, that their whole function is to generate consciousness. That's why it's called the reticular activating system. It activates the cortex. It's the cortex is only, I mean, this is not controversial. The evidence is just like 100% there, that the cortex only is conscious when it is aroused by the reticular activating system. Magoon and Maruzzi showed in 1949, you sever, as they did in cats, the ascending fibers, the axons coming up from the reticular activating system to the cortex loses all consciousness. So the consciousness is entirely supplied by the upper brain stem. And it's only in recent years that we realize that that's not just a power supply, that consciousness has a content and a quality. It is affect, it's feeling. So we feel our way into our otherwise unconscious cognitions. So why that's important is because for the hard problem is that if you want to identify how and why does consciousness arise, you should be studying this basic, in every sense, the foundational form of consciousness, a form that is called feeling, which has to be felt. In other words, it necessarily is conscious. So, the way David Chalmers put it, he said, there's no cognitive function that the explaining of its function or mechanism will explain why you experience anything. And he's right when it comes to vision and so on, cognitive functions, but you can't say that in relation to affect. You can't say there's no affective function, that if you explain its mechanism, you will explain why you experience it, because how can you explain the mechanism of feeling without explaining why you feel it? Because, that's the whole point of feelings, is you feel them. You haven't understood the mechanism of feeling if it doesn't explain why you experience it, for heaven's sake. So I became interested in relation to the hard problem. I became interested in how does the problem change if we look at this proper, basic, fundamental, elemental form of consciousness called feeling. Now, the interesting thing, and this is why I was so interested in what you just said, when I've said you can't have a feeling without feeling it, it is intrinsically conscious. That's the function we should be looking at. The same applies to dreams. You can't have a dream without being conscious of it, because otherwise it's not a dream. The defining feature of dreaming is that the unconsciousness of sleep is punctuated by this thing called the consciousness of a dream. And I don't think that's. I'm not playing games here. I'm not playing linguistic games or semantic games. I think that there's a deep reason why that is the case. It's because dreams are driven by affective functions. Those affective functions are so affect is being generated during sleep. In other words, there's a problem that's arisen for the organism. It's in a state of uncertainty about something that it's now got to deal with. And the dream is a way of dealing with that affective arousal. In other words, that deviation from where we need to be. It's a biological problem that has arisen during sleep that needs a solution, and the dream is doing the work of getting us, of managing the feeling. It's of in other words, of solving the problem, of getting us back to homeostasis.
It's almost like it makes so much sense that one should study dreams in order to understand consciousness. It's almost like, why did we neglect this for so long?
Oh, well, that's an easy question to answer. It's because, in fact, it's the biggest problem of psychology. Psychology is the science of the mind. And what is a mind if not something subjective? The defining feature of mental life is that it is the subjective being of the organism. it is intrinsically subjective. I mean, hence, you can only observe your own consciousness. You can't observe anybody else's consciousness ever, because they are objects. You're a subject. You can only experience your own subjectivity, consciousness, the mind, subjectivity. These things are an embarrassment to science, because science aspires to objectivity. So how do you do science on something that you can only observe your own?
I know. I wrote one of your lines in the paper is scientists prefer objects over subjects.
Yes, exactly. And now with dreams, it's even worse, because you're having a subjective experience while you're asleep. So there's no behavior that goes with this mental state. The person, the dreamer, is asleep, and so the only way you can get access to their dream is for them to wake up and remember the dream and then report it to you. So it's a single witness retrospective report of a phenomenon that we know is notoriously forgettable. Yes. And also
very inaccurate most of the time.
It's also very hard to translate dream experience into words. We all know that when you try to tell your partner or something, what you dreamt last night, as you're doing it, it isn't really, that doesn't quite convey what it was like.
Yes.
So I think that, you said, why didn't we start there in the first place? I think that it's for these sorts of reasons. It's also for these sorts of reasons that, as I said to you a good few minutes ago now, I said that once the correlation between dreaming and REM sleep had been established, we dropped the dreams and just studied the REM sleep. But please note what grave errors that can lead us into. We lost decades of research effort because we wanted to only study the objective side of the mind-body correlation. I think that, let me say this, the brain is the only thing that we know of in the universe that has subjective experience. And surely this extraordinary quality, it must be doing something, and if that's the case, you're never going to understand how the brain works unless you understand why, unless you take account of its subjectivity. If the subjective, as we all know from our own lived lives, you know that what you do is caused in large part by how you feel. And so if we leave that out of the equation, we're never going to understand how that part of nature works.
There's also a lot of historical. You've already said this, but the behaviorist movement obviously played a big role in this. Also, the fact that dreams are often associated with Sigmund Freud. The Interpretation of Dreams is one of his biggest books, and a lot of people misinterpret a lot of Freud's work, or because of the flaws within it, people don't take it in a context and then disregard a lot of it, which is incorrect. One of your lines was, consciousness of cortical representations contextualize affect. And that context is so important.
Yes. Look, let's just go back to what you said there about the behaviorists, because there's something that we must never forget. I told you, I don't need to tell you, the word psychology, means science of the mind. And the behaviorists excluded the psyche from psychology. Yeah. They said, no, we can't study the mental states because they're subjective. We're only going to study behaviors. How absurd is that? To have psychology without the psyche is, and the mistake there is to adjust the subject that you're studying to the methods that you have available. You've got to adjust the methods to the thing that you're studying. And embarrassing as subjectivity may be to science, it certainly exists in nature. The one thing that we can all be absolutely certain about is that we are experiencing, as Descartes told us. That's the one thing you can be sure of, is that, you exist because you experience. And So, you can't exclude it from science. You've got to find methods that are suited to the study of subjectivity. So that's what Freud did. Freud, I hasten to add, for all of his mistakes, with all of his faults, etc., because I'm not one of those people who thinks that everything that Freud did was correct by any means. But I think that this thing that he did was correct, was to say that the centerpiece of psychological science, in other words, it's you have the psychological science has to be adapted to how do you study subjectivity. And so he didn't hesitate to study subjectivity. His method called free association, it's basically just a sample of the stream of consciousness in a relatively controlled setting. And he used the same method to study dreams. So just getting the patient or the research participant to say everything that comes to consciousness in relation to the remembered elements of the dream. And in doing that, he came to the not very obvious conclusion, that dreams are motivated, in fact, wishful states of mind. And dreams don't look like that to us, most of them. I mean, what about nightmares, for example? Most dreams just seem completely incomprehensible nonsense. But Freud said, no, behind this, and so there you have the weakness of his method, because, I mean, how do you falsify that? You can't falsify it. Yeah. To say behind every dream is a wish, if it's behind the dream is the wish, then you can always find that wish if you're interpreting, like he did. That's the method. But now we have new methods. So, positron emission tomography, you look at the dreaming brain and you see that motivating, wishful seeking mechanism switching on full blast. And so, I don't know if you know this, Tevin, but I became interested in psychoanalysis in large part because of my dream findings. It was sort of, I was trained in an era where psychoanalysis was not part of the university. It wasn't serious science at all. So for me, it was really a big surprise to discover, first of all, that REM sleep is not what generates dreams. Secondly, that what generates dreams is these emotional motivational circuits. And in fact, the most wishful one that we've got, is the one that made me take a second look at Freud.
I can only imagine.
I don't even remember what your question was, but that was my answer to it.
No, it's fine. But I can imagine, because I remember once, I mean, you've said this in other podcasts as well, but I remember you also told me that studying psychoanalysis was akin to, people would describe it as almost being an astronomer studying astrology. So
exactly.
There's so much backtracking you already have to do. And then in order to defend someone like Freud, probably makes it even harder at that point, because people have so many negative connotations to it nowadays.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, I think... Sorry.
No, I think that if we can introduce into psychological science, and we are, in our era, we are, reintroduce the subjectivity in the full sense of the word. In other words, not this function called consciousness, but rather, the actual experiential lived life, the phenomenologic, the qualitative stuff that is the proper subject matter of psychology. Then we've got back to where Freud started from, and then we can go way beyond where Freud ended.
Yeah, no, there is a field called phenomenological psychopathology, which a lot of people are trying to bring into psychiatry and psychopathology, just to assist with that lived experience aspect of it all. But anyway, Mark, let's move on to to affect. Coming, as I said, that quote of yours, consciousness of cortical representations contextualize affect. Then let's discuss those three features of affect first and move on from there. I mean, you describe them as valence, qualia, and action. You want to go into detail with that before we move on?
Yeah. Well, the thing that distinguishes affects from other mental states is the valence, first and foremost. affects are intrinsically valenced. In other words, they have an intrinsic goodness or badness about them. And importantly, that goodness or badness is goodness and badness to me, for me. It's subjective. So they are valenced subjective states. Objects don't have intrinsic valence. It's only this subjective state that has this intrinsic valence, this subjective state called affect. But pleasure and unpleasure, valence, is a continuous variable. You start at this end, there's unpleasure, and you carry on, through neutral to pleasure. You can quantify it on a single scale. It can be reduced to a common denominator. But affects are not. They are categorical variables in the sense that it's not just I feel good or I feel bad. It's that I feel bad about what, So hunger is a particular need, which is different from thirst, which is another need, which is different from sleepiness, which is another need. They all of them unpleasant, but they have to be categorically distinct from each other, because each of those needs has to be met in its own right. You can't say I've got 8 out of 10 of sleepiness and 4 out of 10 of thirst, therefore I've got 12 out of 20 of total need, or total unpleasure. So therefore all I'm going to do is sleep. I'm reducing the total number. You'll die if you don't drink also. So this is a very important point. It's such a simple point, yes, that I think that we can easily just sort of like skim over it. But I really want to emphasize it, that affects therefore must be qualitatively distinct from each other, because they have to be treated as categorical variables. There's no alternative. You have to treat each need in its own right. And so the subjective experience of the valence has to be valence in relation to this one, in relation to this one, in relation to this one. And why that's important is because that means that, because remember, categorical variables are qualitatively distinguished from each other. 8 out of 10 of sleep is not the same thing as 8 out of 10 of thirst. They're qualitatively different. Categorical variables work like that. Why that's so important is because there you have the necessary basis for qualia. Qualia have to exist in the mind, in the sense that you have these subjective states which are intrinsically valenced, and they also are intrinsically qualitatively distinct from each other. And I think that that's really important in terms, again, of the hard problem of consciousness. Why do we have these qualitative states? Well, there's one very good reason why we have them. The third aspect that you mentioned, which is the behavior, it's acting on those states, because these are not nice to haves. These are needs. These are phenotypic needs. If you don't meet those needs, you die. I mean, that's how homeostasis works. So we have inbuilt behaviors, that they're reflexes or instincts that go with each of these different phenotypic needs, like foraging behavior and sexual behavior and sleep behavior and etc. But we're born with those things. They're far too stereotyped. They're not even nearly enough to be able to enable us to meet our needs in the great unpredictable variety of situations that we find ourselves in, including many novel situations. And so we have to supplement these behaviors with through learning from experience, and so we have, in addition to these innate predictions, which we call reflexes and instincts, we have then the full gamut of all of the different things that we do. And I just want to add this last point. Please note that everything we do ultimately, if you look at it biologically, is in order to meet our needs, in order to stay alive, in order to survive and reproduce, to take us back to that thing about the purpose of life that we were speaking about at the beginning of our conversation. So
Continue, Mark. Sorry, I was.
No. That's what I wanted to say. So that's what affects are.
It's intriguing because I mean, at some point in your paper, you eventually bring up the knowledge argument to sort of solidify this aspect. I was chatting by email with Frank Jackson about that, trying to get him on the show, but he says he's taking a break from social media because I think that's one of the best arguments to show someone an example of, I mean, that pure essence of feeling. When Mike's episode came out, I had people going at it in the comment section. You have people discussing how, because Mike at some point had said that the only way to truly know, to truly get a future where we can all integrate and cooperate better, is if we slowly learn what each other are experiencing more and more. And the only true way to know what someone else is experiencing is to actually experience what they're experiencing, because otherwise there's no other way. It's pretty much an impossible reality at that point. And then people will bring up the knowledge argument and saying, okay, well, if they have all the theory, why is that impossible? Do you want to touch on that and give them an answer?
Well, just in case there's people watching or listening who are not familiar with the knowledge argument,
Yes.
it is in simplified form. This is my simplification of it. That there's a visual neuroscientist named Mary, and she knows everything that there is to know about the mechanisms of vision, the physiological processes whereby visual information is processed. But Mary's blind. That's my simplified part of it. Yes. And so she doesn't know what it is like to see. She knows everything. That's the knowledge. She's got all the knowledge about how visual information is processed in the brain, but she knows nothing about what it is like to see, the actual qualitative phenomenological experience of vision. And so Jackson's argument those days, because he's changed his mind, by the way, but in 1982, when he published that, he said that shows that the actual qualitative phenomenological experience of seeing is not accounted for by the causal physical mechanism. It exists in some other plane. And nothing about her knowledge of the physical mechanisms of vision prepared Mary for what it is like to see, even gave her any reason to predict that there would be something it is like to see. It seems, therefore, that the qualitative subjective experience of seeing isn't necessary. It doesn't do anything. It's just, and so where does it fit into the mechanism? It doesn't. That was the knowledge argument. So my response to that was, that's because, as I've said previously in this conversation, because vision is not an intrinsically conscious function. You can understand everything about how visual information processing works, because without reference to what it is like to see, because visual information processing can work without you having any experiential vision. Yeah. I mean, your phone can see. The camera in your phone sees a face, recognizes a face, takes a photograph of a face, remembers, therefore, that face, all of that stuff. But there's nothing it's like to be a camera or to be a phone.
And it does it even better, because if you click, remove the nose, the phone knows exactly which parts to remove. So it sees even better than us.
Yeah. So all of this very complicated visual information processing can go on without any experience. Now, as I said earlier, that does not apply to another function. So that's the function of vision. But the function of feeling, you cannot explain the function of feeling without knowing what it is like to feel, without explaining why it feels like something. If Mary was an affective neuroscientist, actually, first of all, if Mary was an affective neuroscientist who'd never experienced affect, she would in fact be dead, because her brainstem mechanisms that keep her alive, would not be working. And in a manner of speaking, that's also an important point. It's that this is not fluff. Feeling has massive causal consequences. Patients in coma, they die unless we keep them alive. You can't live without being conscious. And in other words, the consciousness is doing something bloody important. So that was my argument, is that had we started with affect rather than with vision, the knowledge problem would never have arisen, and the hard problem, which comes 13 years later, Chalmers builds on Jackson's knowledge argument. In fact, it's a very pivotal to Chalmers's whole view. Yeah. That you can explain the function without explaining why there's an experience attached to the execution of that function. That's pretty much the essence of the hard problem.
I made a note here. I made a note here saying unconscious feeling is an oxymoron. You also wrote
exactly.
That. I liked it. Yeah, that's a very nice one.
Yeah. But please remember, Tevin, what I'm saying is that it's not only that it's an oxymoron. It is an oxymoron, but it's an oxymoron for a very good reason.
Yes.
It's when I say that that feeling is where we should, feeling is the elemental form of consciousness, and we should study that if we want to understand its mechanism, how it arises, why it arises. Then let us not forget that the part of the brain that generates feelings is the part of the brain that generates consciousness. It's like this is intrinsically consciousness generating tissue. So it's not just a word, that feeling must be felt. It is that what this part of the brain is doing is generating states of consciousness. It's the whole reason that the arousal activating systems are there.
I have to say, because when I first started reading your work on affect and the way you were approaching consciousness, I remember also initially thinking, this is a bit out there. So when you say like people might think it's crazy and stuff, I can get where you're coming from. But the more you read it, the more you see the evidence, the more you talk about it, it almost becomes very obvious. It's almost like you're highlighting a problem that we've been ignoring for quite some time. How do you feel about it? Do you feel like it's about time people took this approach, or do you think it's gaining some traction in the way people perceive the problem?
Well, I'll tell you, since we started our conversation, this conversation now, we were talking about my recent trip to Boston, and other speakers at that meeting. There's Mike Levin, Chris Fields, Carl Friston. What's his name? Richard, I forget his surname. Watson, yes. These are, apologies, Richard Watson, if you're watching. These are really, really outstanding minds, And so my paper, I said to them, look, I wanted to, because the conference was mostly about biological versus artificial minds. Yes. And I said, I'm doing work in that area and I really want to get there to talk to you guys about this. But I want to spend at least the first half of my talk just setting out my stall for why I believe that we're looking in the wrong place. It's not cortical. It's a brainstem function and it's an affective function and so on. And I set out all the evidence for them. I said, the reason I'm doing this is because, to my great surprise, many people still, don't believe this. And I just can't understand it. What am I doing wrong can't you see the evidence? And so at that conference, because you're asking me, is it gaining traction? All of those guys who I just mentioned, they all were 100% on site. So yeah, I think, well, gosh, so that's very, very gratifying. But I want to, while I'm busy saying immodest things, I want to go back a little bit earlier than this Boston symposium. Tom Nagel, the other day at the consciousness conference, he gave the keynote paper, and Tom Nagel, who wrote the 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, spoke about everything that's happened since then in consciousness studies. I mean, it's really like the kind of the great grandfather of the modern philosophy of consciousness. He's in his talk about 2/3 of the way through it. I mean, I couldn't believe my ears. I'm sitting there listening to Tom Nagel. It's a wonderful treat, giving us this great sweeping sort of description of where he started and where things have gone since then, and where things are now, and how he sees the future. How does he see the future? Well, he says, I think this guy called Mark Solms is doing the right thing. he's pointed out that feelings are intrinsically conscious states. And I think that's right, and I think that's the way forwards. I thought, wow, I've arrived, Tom Nagel, in that lecture, he name-checked two people. One was Mark Solms, the other one was Baruch Spinoza.
Oh, wow. That's a lot. That's one of the best name drops you can get. If you think of Tom Nagel, he's like the father of modern philosophy of mind at this point. Tom Nagel's probably the most quoted philosopher, and I think David Chalmers with his heart problem is probably follows right after. But so that's pretty epic.
Yeah. I was really, not only because remember you asked me, is it gaining traction? I wasn't only gratified, and I was deeply gratified, but to tell you the truth, I was frankly surprised. I would never have thought that Tom Nagel would say, no, actually, I think we are making progress toward a physical theory of experience. That's really news.
Well, I just want to say congrats. If that comes out of Tom's mouth, it must have been surreal in the moment.
Yeah, it was. It really was.
But even from my own experience, Mark, when I spoke to Carl Friston, when I spoke to these other guys about your work, there's clearly a huge respect for it. These guys clearly understand it. They know what you're talking about, and they think the approach is a good approach. It's not one that they're discounting when they discuss these matters.
Yes, that's. No, I really think that it's true to say that it is gaining traction, but it's also true to say that it wasn't the case initially. It's
because I also at the time when I remember when I first started the podcast, there were some people who think, because I think they tend to associate your viewpoint at this point with just an ancient brain, and there's almost a negative connotation to saying those words, as if you're talking about something ancient in itself. But
and I understand where that comes from. It's because, in fact, I must say I blame Paul MacLean for that. This whole thing about the triune brain, that that there's this kind of cartoon idea that there's a reptilian brain, sort of trapped inside of our brains now. So I want to make clear that when I say ancient, what I mean is phylogenetically ancient in the sense that because all vertebrates have the architecture of the upper brainstem that I'm talking about, because we share with all vertebrates a reticular activating system and a periaqueductal gray. That means we have a common ancestor that had that structure. The common ancestor of all vertebrates is 550 million years ago. So I'm talking about that guy, the one 550 million years ago. That's what's ancient. I'm saying that this structure evolved. And what that means is that the dawn of consciousness, if I'm right, that this structure is what's generating the raw feeling, the most elementary form of consciousness. The dawn of consciousness was at least 550 million years ago. That's what I mean by ancient. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of misinterpretations, but because of the fact that you're going to these conferences, you have people like Tom Nagel now obviously supporting you. Hopefully people understand it more or give it more time in order to gain that understanding. Because I think that's a fundamental approach, is to actually read your work, read your papers, and then draw a better conclusion.
Yes. I suppose the best thing that can happen is that people read your work and they're persuaded by it. The second best or middle thing out of three that can happen is they read your work and they disagree with you and they reject it. The worst thing that can happen is that they just ignore it completely. So even when you initially get negative pushback, at least it's not just completely overlooked.
Yes, it's true. It's sometimes naming a theory well gives it that negative pushback you need. So like sometimes saying things like the ancient brain is like Keith Frankish or Dennett saying it's an illusion. It helps with the name. That illusionism gives it that push that it almost needs at the time.
While you're on that subject, I know we're nearly out of time, but I want to say something else about feeling, which is that unlike perception, it cannot be an illusion. You can't say you are currently having the illusion that you're in pain. You just are in pain. You can't say that you having the illusion that you're sad. You might say you have no good reason to be sad, but still you're sad. And I think that that's also important. That when we speak about what do we mean by consciousness as an illusion, or I think it's not this. It doesn't have exactly the same meaning when you speak about an illusion that the brain constructs its own sort out of its own ingredients. It constructs the illusion of a three-dimensional world out there with colors that actually the colors are a product of your brain rather than a property of the world. Feeling. Because it's about yourself, it just is what it is. You can't have illusory feelings.
And it's because I was just about to say, it's almost like the argument of illusionism can't work against your view of consciousness, because it's fundamentally talking about different things. Because the illusionists come at it from a very much cortical perspective in the first place. So
yes. Now I realize while we're speaking about this that I didn't address a point you made earlier, and it suddenly becomes relevant again now. You said, "What do I mean when I say that perception contextualizes affect?" And this is exactly the right place to come back to that. So how it works is that you have the feeling. That is just the consciousness. Then it's a matter of what is causing that feeling, and what can I do about that feeling. So I like to use this this wording, but of course I'm translating something into words that is not verbal. It is, first of all, the creature feels like this. It's just raw feeling. I feel like this. And then secondly, it's a matter of I feel like this about that. And so the affect is, as it were, applied to the context within which it's occurring. So it's these things that are making me feel like this, and it's there that I can do something about this feeling. And so this is what I mean when I say we feel our way into our cognitions and we feel our way into our perceptions.
I like that approach.
Yeah. So you said it's good to have a catchphrase, a catchy phrase. You said it's good to have a controversial one, but somebody recently wrote a review of different theories of consciousness, and they wanted me to tell them what's my theory called. So I said I'm calling it the felt uncertainty. It's the felt uncertainty theory, and I think that's another way in which you can put what I've just said. Now it's like it's like the common currency is uncertainty. It's like I feel like this. In other words, I'm not in a state of certainty. Otherwise, you wouldn't be feeling. The feeling, always remember, is a deviation from homeostasis, and then it's a matter of you apply that uncertainty to your actions. Feeling your way through, is this working? Is that working? Is this working? Is that working? So it's a matter of affects, you palpate your confidence in your current action program on the basis of whether or not it is moving the needle in the right direction affectively. So it's I like to put it like, in fact, it was Carl who put it like this. He said that if things are turning out as expected on the basis of my actions, if things are turning out as expected, that's good. And if uncertainty prevails, that's bad.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So it's sort of, it allows you to gauge the environment and interact with it in a very successful manner, and to maintain homeostatic.
In order to maintain homeostasis.
In order to maintain homeostasis. Yeah. The felt, will you call it the felt uncertainty principle?
Yeah.
It's quite a nice. I was thinking about it as well before coming into this conversation. How Carl has one of his papers. He calls it "I am, therefore I think." Kevin Mitchell has "I feel, therefore I am." I mean, I move, therefore I am, and you could make it "I feel, therefore I am" is another one.
Yeah.
just to add that to the lecture series in the future. Mark, before we finish, one last thing about this. The conference was about AI. Anything you want to add about feeling and artificial intelligence and the implications for the future?
Yes, I am working with a team of physicists and roboticists and computer scientists on an artificial consciousness. We've been at it for about 2 years. We've got some good funding from the Oppenheimers, by the way.
Oh, wow.
We're now going into our second phase. And I'm really very optimistic about what we're doing there. We're trying, because we believe that we've isolated, at least in broad outline, the causal mechanism. How feelings are generated, how and why they're generated. If you've done that, if you really have done that, then you should be able to engineer it.
Yes.
In fact, it was Richard Feynman who said, right at the end of his life, it was found on his blackboard. If I can't create it, I don't understand it. And so, this is what we're trying to do. We're saying, well, if this really is the mechanism, then we should be able to engineer artificial feelings. Remember, we're not creating a living thing. We're creating an artificial agent that has exactly the mechanisms I was describing to you earlier about different needs and having to balance those needs, and they are intrinsically valence to and for that agent, and they are categorically distinct, and et cetera, et cetera. And then this should be able to display the kinds of behaviors that I was describing to you, where you can feel your way through a problem, come up with novel solutions. That should display voluntary behaviors. And it should be able to survive in unpredicted environments and so on. So these are the sorts of things we're doing. And I really do believe it's a matter not of whether, but when we'll succeed with that. It's another story about how do you persuade your colleagues. The problem of other minds and all of that is not a small thing. What we are going to be doing is having a symposium with interest parties where we must determine in advance what will be acceptable criteria. You can't say there's no way that you will ever persuade me at all. You have to say, well, what will persuade you? Yes. And then the ethics of that. We must always keep very clear in our minds that there's two sets of ethical problems. The one is the one that people most frequently refer to is, but you're going to create these super intelligent creatures that are trying to survive, and they're going to compete with us, and that's bad for us. But we must also remember that if you create an artificial consciousness, if it feels, then it can suffer, and you have to be very careful about what are you producing here, and it's all of the problems that we have in animal research become relevant then to this sort of research too.
Mark, I'm sorry, I don't know how much time you have left, but I'm so curious to know, how does one even approach this? How do you even start building this sort of artificial complexity?
Well, you start with the formalisms that Carl and I published a paper in 2018. He published that brilliant paper in 2013 called Life as We Know It. And there he reduced two formalisms, the mechanisms of, fundamentally it was the mechanisms of homeostasis. Because the whole mechanism of self-organization is what underwrites the mechanism of homeostasis. When he says life as we know it, I mean, homeostasis is the mechanism of life as we know it. It's what distinguishes living things. So what was I saying? Yeah, so that the formalisms that he developed to explain homeostasis, we extended those formalisms to explain felt homeostasis in our 2018 paper. And then, I got this team together, and we're using those to develop that formalism to develop algorithms to create artificial agents that have homeostatic needs in order for them to continue to survive. It's just a simple mechanical unpacking of this thing. It's creating exactly those dynamics in an artificial agent, and creating an environment within which we can have the sorts of dynamics that we need. In other words, changing. So the agent has to meet various needs of its own, like power supply and all of that. And then the resources, where they are, we move them around. Once it's learnt, okay, this is how, if I do this, I can survive, then we change it, and then And then we created situations where it's not just a matter of exploiting resources, but also there's a hill that it can go up and have a look around. We want to see, does it realize that if I go up there, I see that I see. So that's sort of roughly where we are now. We've got a long way to go, but a major part of the next phase that we're going to do is to have multiple agents. So where they have to interact with each other, and they have to make inferences about each other's mental processes as part of the same thing.
Oh, that's super exciting.
But I'm sorry about the interruption, but I'm going to have to go. It was really great talking to you again, Tevin.
Mark, it's been a pleasure always. And thank you so much for, I know you don't like to call it a round two, it sounds like a boxing match, but hopefully there's a round three, four, and many to go as you continue on this amazing journey. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your interest and your time.
Always a pleasure. Cheers.